The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I finally opened it. Each morning, I'd pour my coffee, glance at it, and feel my stomach twist into knots. My name was written in my mother's careful handwriting, the same script that had marked my lunch bags throughout elementary school, the same letters that had signed permission slips and report cards with little hearts dotting the I's. But we hadn't spoken in 8 months, and that silence felt like a canyon between us that grew wider every day. I was 28, living in a cramped studio apartment in Portland that smelled perpetually of the Indian restaurant downstairs. The space was barely 400 square feet, with a Murphy bed that I had to fold up every morning just to have room to move around. My kitchen was a hot plate, a mini fridge, and a sink that only worked if you jiggled the handle just right. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, every inch of it paid for by my freelance graphic design work. Some months I barely made rent. Other months, when a good client came through or I sold a few pieces at the local art fair, I could afford more than ramen and peanut butter sandwiches. But it was my choice, my struggle, my life. Or at least, that's what I told myself during the lonely nights when I wondered if my parents had been right all along. The last conversation with my parents had been a disaster that had been building for years. It started, like most of our fights, over a simple question during Sunday dinner. "So, Marcus, how's work going?" I should have just said fine, and moved on to safer topics like the weather or my cousin's new baby. Instead, I made the mistake of being honest. "Actually, I'm working on something really exciting. There's a nonprofit that wants me to design their entire visual identity, logo, website, marketing materials, the whole package. It won't pay much, but the cause is amazing and it could really help build my portfolio." My father set down his fork with that particular heavy sigh that I had learned to dread. "Marcus, you're 28 years old. When are you going to stop treating your career like a hobby and start thinking about your future?" "This is my future, Dad. This is what I'm building." "Building what? You can barely afford to live in that shoebox you call an apartment. Your mother and I..." Here we go again. I pushed back from the table, the familiar anger rising in my chest. "Don't... Here we go again, me young man." My father's voice took on that stern tone that made me feel like I was still 15 years old. "Your mother and I sacrificed everything so you could have opportunities we never had. We sent you to good schools, paid for your college education. I never asked you to do that. And this is how you repay us? By throwing it all away to chase pipe dreams?" My mother tried to intervene, as she always did. "David, please. Marcus, honey, we just want you to be secure." "No, Mom. You want me to be what you think I should be. There's a difference." The fight escalated from there, voices rising, old wounds reopened. My father brought up my cousin Jake, who had just bought a house in the suburbs with his accounting job. My mother mentioned their neighbor's daughter, who was a lawyer and could afford to take her parents on vacation. I countered with stories of successful artists and designers, of people who had made it work, of the meaning and fulfillment that came from doing what you loved. But underneath all our words was a deeper conversation we never seemed able to have. They saw my choices as a rejection of their values, their hard work, their dreams for me. I saw their criticism as conditional love, support that came with strings attached, acceptance that required me to be someone I wasn't. The fight ended with my father's words ringing in my ears. "We didn't sacrifice everything so you could throw your life away on pipe dreams." I left their house that night and hadn't been back since. Phone calls became text messages, then text messages became silence. Birthdays passed unmarked. Holidays became solitary affairs with takeout Chinese food and whatever was on Netflix. The isolation was harder than I had expected. Portland was full of creative people, and I had made some friends through work and art shows. But there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being cut off from your family. It's the loneliness of inside jokes that no one else gets, of childhood memories that only they shared, of traditions that suddenly mean nothing because there's no one left to share them with. I threw myself into work, taking on more freelance projects than I could reasonably handle. I told myself it was about building my career, proving my parents wrong, showing them that I could make it on my own. But really, it was about filling the silence in my apartment, about having something to do besides think about the last things we had said to each other. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday in March, when Portland's famous rain had been falling for so many days straight that I had forgotten what sunshine looked like. It was mixed in with bills and junk mail, but my mother's handwriting stood out immediately. My heart started racing before I even picked it up. For 3 days, I moved around it like it was a bomb that might explode if I handled it wrong. I knew that whatever was inside would change something, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that change. The silence between us had become familiar, predictable. It hurt, but it was a hurt I understood. Opening that envelope meant stepping into unknown territory. Finally, on Friday night, after a particularly brutal week of revisions from a client who couldn't seem to make up their mind about anything, I poured myself a glass of the cheap wine I kept for emergencies and sat down at my tiny kitchen table. The envelope contained 2 things: a single photograph and a folded letter. The photograph took my breath away. It was old, the colors slightly faded, and the edges yellowed with age, clearly from the early 1990s based on the fashion and the style of the cars visible in the background. It showed my parents in their early 20s, standing outside a small art gallery. But they weren't the people I knew, or thought I knew. My mother was holding a paintbrush, her fingers still stained with what looked like blue and yellow paint. Her hair was longer than I had ever seen it, wild and curly, and she was wearing a flowing skirt covered in paint splatters and a tank top that revealed a small tattoo on her shoulder that I had never known existed. She was smiling at the camera with a joy so pure and radiant that it made my chest ache. When was the last time I had seen her smile like that? My father stood beside her, wearing a paint-splattered apron over jeans and a t-shirt. His hair was longer too, and he had the beginning of a beard. His arm was around my mother's waist, and he was looking at her instead of the camera, his expression soft and proud. Behind them, a hand-painted sign read, "Emma and David Martinez, Emerging Artists Showcase." I stared at the photograph for a long time, trying to reconcile these young, artistic, obviously happy people with the middle-aged, conservative, perpetually worried parents I knew. My mother, who now wore sensible cardigans and kept her gray hair in a neat bob, had once dressed like a bohemian artist. My father, who had worked at the same insurance company for as long as I could remember, and whose idea of casual wear was khakis and a polo shirt, had once worn paint-stained aprons and looked at my mother like she hung the moon. With trembling hands, I unfolded the letter. "My dearest Marcus, I've started this letter a dozen times over the past few months, and I never know quite how to begin. How do you apologize for years of saying the wrong thing? How do you explain a lifetime of choices in a few pages? How do you tell your son that you've been afraid of the very thing you once were? I know you're angry with us, and maybe you have every right to be. Your father and I have been talking, really talking, for the first time in years since our last fight. We've been forced to look at ourselves, at our choices, at the way we've handled your dreams, and we don't like what we see. But before I can apologize, I need to tell you a story you've never heard. I need to tell you about who we were before you came along, because I think it might help you understand why we've been so afraid, The photograph I included was taken at our first art show together. Your father and I met in art school. Did you know that? I was a painting major, and he was studying sculpture and ceramics. We were both 21, broke, idealistic, and completely in love with art and with each other. We spent our days in the studio and our nights in coffee shops, talking about color theory and composition, about the artists we admired and the pieces we wanted to create. Your father's hands were always covered in clay dust, and I had permanent paint stains under my fingernails. We thought we were going to change the world, one canvas and one sculpture at a time. After graduation, we moved to Portland. Yes, the same Portland where you live now. We rented a tiny studio apartment in the Arts District, even smaller than what you have now, and converted half of it into a workspace. We had canvases stacked against every wall and a pottery wheel set up next to the kitchen table. It was chaotic and beautiful, and everything we had dreamed about. We scraped together enough money for that first show by selling plasma and working part-time jobs at coffee shops and bookstores. I remember the opening night so clearly. We stood in that little gallery, watching people look at our work, actually considering buying pieces we had poured our hearts into. Your father sold 3 small sculptures that night, and I sold 2 paintings. We felt like we had made it. But making it as artists, Marcus, is so much harder than it looks from the outside. The gallery took a 50% commission, which meant those 5 pieces that felt like such a victory barely covered our rent for the month. The reviews were mixed. One critic called your father's work promising but unrefined, and another said my paintings showed technical skill but lacked emotional depth. We told ourselves it was just the beginning, that every artist faced rejection and criticism, that we just needed to keep working and improving. And we did keep working. God, how we worked. Your father would spend 12-hour days in the studio, coming home covered in clay dust with his hands cracked and bleeding from the work. I painted until my back ached from hunching over canvases, until I could barely afford paint, but kept buying it anyway because I couldn't stop creating. We had 3 more shows over the next 2 years. Each one felt like it might be the one that changed everything, and each one ended with modest sales and encouraging but not life-changing reviews. We were good, Marcus, but we weren't great. We were passionate, but passion doesn't pay the bills. Then I got pregnant with you. I remember the moment I saw those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test. I was sitting in our tiny bathroom and I could hear your father working on a piece in the next room, the scraping of his tools against clay. I knew that everything was about to change. Suddenly, the irregular income that had seemed romantic when it was just us became terrifying when we thought about providing for a baby. The tiny studio apartment that had felt like our artistic sanctuary became impossibly small for a family. The late nights working on pieces became early mornings at whatever jobs we could find that offered health insurance. Your father applied for a position at Patterson Insurance the day after we found out I was pregnant. He lied on the application, omitting his art background and emphasizing the business classes he had taken as electives. He got the job, and I watched him trade his clay-covered jeans for business suits and his flexible artist's schedule for 9-to-5 stability. I kept painting for a few more months, but morning sickness made the smell of turpentine unbearable, and I was exhausted all the time. I took a job as a substitute teacher because it offered benefits and some flexibility. The plan was for it to be temporary, just until you were born, and we could figure out a better arrangement. But babies, as you'll someday learn, have a way of rearranging all your priorities. The moment I held you, Marcus, everything else became secondary. You were this tiny, perfect person who depended entirely on us, And the thought of not being able to provide for you was more terrifying than any bad review or rejection letter we had ever received. We sold our canvases first, the ones that hadn't sold at shows, the ones we had been keeping as backups or examples of our work. Then we sold the easels and the pottery wheel. Your father's sculpture tools went to a young artist who reminded us of ourselves, and I gave my paints to a high school art teacher who promised to use them with students who couldn't afford their own supplies. We told ourselves it was temporary. Once you were older, once we had more stability, once we had saved some money, we would go back to art. But life has a way of pulling you forward, and before we knew it, months had turned into years. Your father got promoted at the insurance company. He was good at his job, methodical, careful, reliable, all the qualities that had made him a decent sculptor but made him an excellent insurance adjuster. I got my teaching certificate and started working full-time at the elementary school. We bought a house in Hillsborough, in a good school district with safe streets and neighbors who waved when they saw us working in the yard. We created a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like what we thought successful adults were supposed to have. Steady jobs, a mortgage, a retirement plan, college savings for you. We joined the PTA and hosted barbecues and took family vacations to places like Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon. But sometimes, late at night when you were asleep, your father and I would look at each other across the dinner table and wonder where those young artists had gone. We would talk about maybe setting up a small studio in the garage, about taking a ceramics class at the community college, about visiting galleries again. But there was always something else that needed our attention. Your school events, home repairs, work responsibilities. Years passed, then decades. When you were in high school and started showing interest in art, something inside me both soared and panicked. You would come home with sketches and paintings, talking excitedly about color and composition, and I saw myself at your age. I saw that passion, that certainty that art was the most important thing in the world. But I also remembered the rejection letters, the financial stress, the slow realization that talent and passion weren't always enough. I remembered the ache of giving up something you loved because you had responsibilities that mattered more. When you majored in art in college, when you chose graphic design as your career path, we weren't disappointed in you, Marcus. We were terrified for you. We knew how hard that path could be because we had walked it once. We knew about the rejection letters and the empty bank accounts and the looks of pity from family members who thought we were wasting our potential. But we also knew something else that we never told you. We knew the indescribable joy of creating something beautiful from nothing. We knew the satisfaction of solving a visual problem that seemed impossible. We knew the thrill of seeing your work in public, of having someone connect with something that came from your imagination and your hands. We knew because we had felt it once too. Your father and I handled this all wrong. Instead of sharing our story with you, instead of being honest about our fears and our own experiences, we tried to protect you by discouraging you. Instead of supporting your dreams while helping you navigate the practical challenges, we focused only on the obstacles. Instead of celebrating the courage it takes to be an artist in this world, the same courage we had once had but somehow lost, we tried to scare you into what we thought was safety. Last month, your father and I were having coffee downtown, and we walked past that new coffee shop on Morrison Street. You know the one, with the exposed brick walls and the local art on display. And there, hanging right by the entrance, was one of your poster designs, the one for the environmental nonprofit's fundraiser. We stood there for 20 minutes, Marcus, just looking at it. It was beautiful. It was creative and smart and meaningful. Everything we used to dream about creating. The colors were bold but harmonious. The typography was perfect. and the message was clear without being heavy-handed. Other customers kept stopping to look at it too, and I heard one woman tell her friend that she was definitely going to attend the event because the poster made it look so interesting. That's when we realized that our sacrifice had worked exactly as it was supposed to. We gave up our artistic dreams so that you could have the stability and education to pursue yours. But instead of celebrating that success, instead of being proud that our 28 years of steady jobs and reliable income had given you the foundation to take risks we never could, we got scared and tried to talk you out of the very thing we had worked so hard to make possible for you. We were living vicariously through you, Marcus, but in the worst possible way. Instead of celebrating your victories, we were reliving our defeats. Instead of supporting your journey, we were projecting our own fears onto your life. That night, your father and I had the longest, most honest conversation we've had in years. We talked about those young people in the photograph, about what happened to them, about whether they had made the right choices. We talked about you, about the fight, about all the things we wish we had said differently. Your father wants to take pottery classes at the community college. Can you believe that? After 28 years of insurance claims and actuarial tables, he wants to get his hands dirty with clay again. I've been thinking about watercolors, something less overwhelming than the oils I used to work with, but still a way to create something beautiful. It's probably too late for us to be the artists we once dreamed of being. We're 53 and 55 now, with mortgage payments and health concerns and all the responsibilities that come with middle age. But maybe it's not too late to remember why we fell in love with creating in the first place. And maybe it's not too late to tell our son that we're proud of him for having the courage we lost somewhere along the way. You're doing it, Marcus. You're actually doing the thing we could only dream about. You're making a living as an artist. You're creating work that matters. You're building the life that your father and I always wished we could have built. And instead of celebrating that incredible achievement, we've been so focused on our fears that we almost lost you entirely. I know we have a lot of rebuilding to do. I know that trust, once broken, doesn't heal overnight. But if you're willing, I would love the chance to tell you more stories about who we were before we became your parents. I'd love to show you some of the paintings I still have stored in the basement, and maybe even paint something new. Your father has been sketching again. Did you know that? Little drawings on sticky notes during meetings, doodles in the margins of insurance forms. Last week, I found a whole notebook filled with ideas for sculptures, drawn during his lunch breaks. We love you, son. Not the version of you we thought we wanted you to become, but the actual you. The artist, the dreamer, the young man who inherited our passion, but had the courage to hold on to it when we couldn't. I hope you'll call us. Love always, Mom. P.S. There's something else I need to tell you. That nonprofit poster we saw? We drove around for an hour looking for more copies of it. We found 3 more locations where it was displayed, and we took pictures of each one. They're on our refrigerator now, right next to your kindergarten artwork and your high school graduation photo. We should have been displaying your work proudly all along. I read the letter twice before I could see clearly through my tears. By the 3rd reading, I was sobbing. Not the quiet, dignified crying I had done when we first stopped speaking, but the ugly, body-shaking kind of crying that comes when years of misunderstanding suddenly crystallize into clarity. All those years, I had seen their criticism as evidence that they didn't understand me, that they valued financial security over personal fulfillment, that they saw my choices as a rejection of their values and their sacrifices. I had never imagined that their fear came from experience, that their worry was rooted in love, that their anxiety about my chosen path was because they had walked that path themselves and knew both its beauty and its challenges. I thought about all the things they had given up that I had never noticed, the way my mother's hands always seemed to be moving when she was thinking, as if they remembered holding a brush, the way my father would pause in front of paintings in restaurants and galleries, studying them with an intensity that seemed out of place for someone who claimed not to get art. The way they had always made sure I had art supplies for school projects, even when money was tight. There were other signs, too, things I had dismissed or never thought to question. The way my mother could identify different painting techniques just by looking at them. The way my father always seemed to know exactly how to fix things around the house, working with his hands in ways that seemed almost sculptural. The art books on their shelves that I had assumed were just decoration, but now realized were probably remnants of their old life. I thought about the fights we had had over the years, and how different they looked through this new lens. When they had criticized my impractical career choice, they weren't dismissing my dreams. They were reliving their own disappointments. When they had suggested I pursue something more stable, they weren't trying to crush my creativity. They were trying to spare me the pain they had experienced when passion collided with reality. But I also felt angry, and that anger was justified. Why hadn't they told me this story years ago? Why had they let me feel like I was disappointing them, like I was throwing away their sacrifices, when the truth was so much more complicated? Why had they made me choose between their approval and my dreams when they, of all people, should have understood what those dreams meant to me? That night, I walked around my tiny studio apartment, seeing it with new eyes. The cramped space, the Murphy bed, the hot plate. It was almost exactly like the life my parents had described living when they were my age. But while they had given up this life when I came along, I was living it by choice, as an adult with no dependents, supported by the foundation they had built through their sacrifice. I was doing exactly what they had once done, but I was doing it with advantages they had never had. Health insurance through the freelancers union they helped me join. A financial safety net in the form of parents who would never let me go hungry even when we weren't speaking. And an education they had paid for that gave me technical skills they had never been able to develop. At 2 a.m, I called them. The phone rang once before my mother picked up, as if she had been waiting by it. Marcus? Her voice was thick with sleep and hope. Mom? My voice cracked on the single word, and I was crying again. Oh, sweetheart. She was crying too, and I could hear her moving around, probably waking up my father. I'm so glad you called. I wasn't sure. I hoped. I got your letter. Are you okay? I know it was a lot to take in. I'm not okay, I said honestly, but I'm not okay because of the letter. I'm not okay because we wasted so much time not understanding each other. My father got on the other extension, the old cordless phone from the kitchen that he always used when he didn't want to disturb my mother in the bedroom. Son? Hi, Dad. I'm sorry. His voice was rough, the way it got when he was trying not to cry. We're both so sorry. I'm sorry too, for shutting you out, for not trying harder to understand where you were coming from. What followed was the longest, most honest conversation we had had since I was a child. We talked until the sun came up, sharing stories and fears and regrets that we had been carrying for years. My parents told me about their life as young artists, not just the romantic, inspiring parts, but the difficult parts too. They told me about the gallery owner who had taken advantage of their naivety and displayed their work without giving them proper credit. They told me about the months when they had survived on peanut butter sandwiches and free coffee from the bookstore where my mother worked. They told me about the fight that had nearly ended their relationship when my father suggested they might need to get real jobs, and my mother accused him of giving up on their dreams. They also told me about the joy, the moments that had made all the struggle worthwhile. The first time someone bought one of my father's sculptures and told him it reminded them of their grandmother. The painting my mother had created of the Portland skyline that had hung in a downtown coffee shop for 2 years, becoming a local landmark that people would bring their out-of-town visitors to see. I told them about my own struggles and victories, things I had never shared because I thought they wouldn't understand, or would use them as ammunition in their arguments for me to find something more stable. I told them about the client who had paid me twice what I had quoted, because they loved my work so much they wanted to make sure I was fairly compensated. I told them about the months when I had lived on rice and beans, and the months when I had made enough to actually save money. We talked about fear, their fear that I would struggle the way they had, my fear that their love was conditional on my success, our shared fear that we had damaged our relationship beyond repair. "You know," my father said at one point, when we had been talking for hours and the conversation had moved into more philosophical territory, "I think I understand now why you got so angry when we criticized your choices." "Yeah?" "We made you feel like you had to choose between having our support and following your dreams. That must have been incredibly lonely." It was such a simple observation, but it was exactly right. It was lonely, Dad. I felt like I was disappointing you just by being who I am. "That's not who you are, son. That's what you do. And what you do is incredible." My mother added, "We should have been bragging about you to everyone we know. Our son, the artist. Our son, who had the courage to follow his passion. Our son, who inherited our love of creating and actually did something with it." By the time we hung up, it was almost 8 a.m. I was exhausted but felt lighter than I had in months. We made plans for them to visit me in Portland the following weekend, not to inspect my living situation or lecture me about my choices, but to see my work, meet my friends, and maybe visit some of the galleries and coffee shops where local artists displayed their pieces. That week, I threw myself into preparing for their visit with an energy I hadn't felt in years. I organized my portfolio, including pieces I had been working on for fun rather than for clients. I researched restaurants and art venues I thought they might enjoy. I cleaned my studio apartment until it sparkled, not because I was ashamed of it anymore, but because I wanted to show it off. This space that I had created, this life that I was building. The morning they arrived, I was nervous in a way I hadn't expected. It had been 8 months since we had seen each other, and our last interaction had been so painful. Would things really be different? Or would we fall back into our old patterns of misunderstanding and hurt? But the moment I opened the door and saw them standing in the hallway, I knew things had fundamentally changed. My mother was holding a small canvas, a watercolor painting of flowers that was clearly her work, painted in a style I had never seen before, but that somehow felt familiar. My father was carrying a small sculpture, rough and obviously the work of someone getting back into the medium after decades away, but unmistakably beautiful. "We brought gifts," my mother said, smiling that radiant smile from the photograph. "We started taking classes," my father added, looking almost shy. "Thought you might like to see what we've been working on." I invited them in, and they spent the next hour looking at everything in my apartment with the kind of attention I had always craved, but never known how to ask for. They studied my work, not with the critical eye of parents worried about their child's financial future, but with the appreciative gaze of fellow artists who understood the challenges and rewards of creating something from nothing. My mother picked up a series of illustrations I had been working on for a children's book and spent a long time examining the details. The way you've handled the light in this scene, it reminds me of some of the techniques I used to use with oils, but adapted for your style. It's brilliant. My father was fascinated by my computer setup and the software I used for digital design. This is incredible, Marcus. You can do things we never even imagined when we were your age. But the principles are the same: composition, color, storytelling. We spent the weekend touring Portland's art scene together. We visited galleries and studios, coffee shops and bookstores that featured local artists' work. Everywhere we went, my parents asked questions, not skeptical questions about whether this was a viable way to make a living, but genuine questions about technique and inspiration and the local arts community. At a gallery in the Pearl District, we met another artist around my age who was having a solo show. When she learned that my parents were visiting from out of town, she assumed they were proud supporters of my work and started telling them about the local art scene, about how collaborative and supportive the community was, about the opportunities available for artists who were willing to work hard and take risks. I watched my parents' faces light up as they listened to her. This was the world they had once inhabited, the world they had given up but never stopped loving. And through my life, they were connected to it again. On Sunday evening, as they were preparing to drive back to Hillsborough, my father pulled me aside. "I want to show you something," he said, pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his photos until he found what he was looking for: a picture of their refrigerator at home. The surface was covered with photos and clippings, but not the usual mixture of family snapshots and grocery lists. Instead, it was entirely devoted to my work. Photos of my poster designs they had found around town, printouts of my website, even a review of a group show I had participated in that mentioned my pieces favorably. "We've been collecting these for years," he said. "Every time we saw your work in public, every time someone mentioned you in a blog or newspaper article, every time we had something to be proud of, we just didn't know how to tell you." My mother joined us, carrying the small painting she had brought as a gift. "We want you to have this," she said. "It's not much. I'm still getting back into the rhythm of it, but I painted it thinking about you, about the life you're building, about how proud we are." The painting was of a window with light streaming through it, and through the window, you could see a garden full of flowers in various stages of bloom. Some were just budding, others were in full flower, and a few were beginning to fade, but were still beautiful in their own way. It was a metaphor for growth, for the different seasons of a life, for the way beautiful things take time to develop. "It's perfect," I said, and I meant it. 6 months later, I helped them set up their first art studio in 29 years. They had decided to convert the garage into a space where my mother could paint and my father could work with clay. It wasn't the romantic artist's loft they had shared in their 20s, but it was theirs, and it was exactly what they needed at this stage of their lives. The process of setting up the studio became a family project. I designed a layout that would give them each adequate workspace while allowing for collaboration. We installed proper lighting, set up storage for supplies, and even created a small gallery wall where they could display finished pieces. Watching them work in that space for the first time was emotional in ways I hadn't anticipated. My father approached his pottery wheel with the reverence of someone returning to a sacred space, and when he centered his first lump of clay in decades, the muscle memory came flooding back. His hands knew what to do even when his mind wasn't sure. My mother set up her easel near the window where the light was best, and when she mixed her first palette of colors, she closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of the paints, like she was greeting old friends. "It feels like coming home," she said, and I understood exactly what she meant. I also made a decision during this time that surprised even me. I moved back to Oregon, not back into my childhood bedroom. I was still an independent adult with my own life and career, but I rented a small house in Southeast Portland, just 30 minutes from my parents' place in Hillsboro. The decision wasn't driven by financial necessity or family obligation, but by choice. I realized that the distance I had put between myself and my parents had been about more than just geography. I had been trying to prove that I didn't need them, that I could build a life entirely separate from their influence. But what I discovered through our reconciliation was that I didn't want to be separate from them. I wanted to be in relationship with them, a healthier, more honest relationship than we had managed before, but a relationship nonetheless. My new house had a small studio space that I converted into my home office, and it quickly became a gathering place for my parents and me to work on projects together. Sometimes my mother would come over to paint while I worked on a design project, and we would listen to music and talk about color and composition. Sometimes my father would stop by with pieces he was working on, seeking feedback or just wanting to share his progress with someone who understood the creative process. These weren't the forced family gatherings of my childhood, where conversation felt stilted and we all struggled to find common ground. These were organic connections between three adults who shared a passion for creating beautiful things. I also started freelancing for local businesses while working on a larger project that had grown out of our family's story. I was creating a series of illustrations and written pieces about people who had deferred their artistic dreams to provide for their families, and then found their way back to creativity later in life. My parents became my first subjects, but I soon discovered that their story was far from unique. I interviewed dozens of people, parents who had given up music careers to become accountants, former dancers who had become nurses, writers who had spent decades in corporate jobs while their novels remained unfinished in desk drawers. Each story was different in its details, but similar in its emotional core: the tension between passion and responsibility, the grief of dreams deferred, and the possibility of finding your way back to creativity even after decades away. The project became more than just illustrations. It evolved into a multimedia exhibition that combined visual art, written narratives, and audio recordings of people telling their own stories. I called it The Long Way Back, and it explored the idea that there isn't just one timeline for artistic fulfillment, that creativity can be a lifelong journey with many different chapters. A local gallery agreed to host the exhibition, and I spent months preparing for the opening night. My parents were intimately involved in every aspect of the project, not just as subjects, but as collaborators. My mother helped me think through the visual presentation of the stories, and my father worked with me on the audio component, using his business skills to help me navigate contracts and logistics. The opening night was unlike anything I had ever experienced as an artist. The gallery was packed with people, not just the usual art crowd, but families, older adults, people who rarely attended gallery openings but had been drawn by the subject matter. Many of the people whose stories I had included brought their own families, creating a multi-generational conversation about creativity, sacrifice, and the different ways we define success. I watched my parents move through the crowd that night, talking to other attendees about their own journey back to art, and I was struck by how comfortable they seemed in that environment. They weren't pretending to be something they weren't. They acknowledged that they were beginners again, that their skills were rusty, that they had a lot to relearn. But they were also confident in their right to be there, in their identity as artists, in ways that I had never seen before. An older woman approached me near the end of the evening, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for this," she said. I'm 67 years old, and I've been telling myself for 40 years that it's too late for me to go back to painting. But seeing all these stories, hearing about your parents, maybe it's not too late." "It's never too late," I told her, and for the first time in my life, I truly believed it. The exhibition was reviewed in several local publications and even got picked up by a national magazine that focused on arts and culture. More importantly, it led to other opportunities: speaking engagements at community colleges and senior centers, commissions from organizations that worked with older adults, and connections with other artists who were exploring similar themes in their work. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the way it deepened my relationship with my parents. Working together on something creative, seeing their enthusiasm and growth, witnessing their courage in starting over, it gave us a shared language and shared experiences that we had never had before. My mother's watercolor skills improved dramatically over the course of that year. She took classes at the community college and joined a local artists group that met weekly to paint together. Her work began to develop its own distinctive style, softer and more impressionistic than the oils she had worked with in her 20s, but with a maturity and emotional depth that came from decades of life experience. My father's pottery journey was more challenging. Clay work is physically demanding, and his 55-year-old hands weren't as strong or flexible as they had been in art school. But he approached it with the same methodical patience he had learned in his insurance career, and slowly his pieces began to show real skill and artistry. He started with simple bowls and cups, then moved on to more complex forms as his confidence grew. More importantly, they were both genuinely happy in ways I hadn't seen since I was very young. The stress and anxiety that had characterized our family dynamics for years began to lift as they rediscovered parts of themselves they had thought were lost forever. Our conversations changed too. Instead of tiptoeing around topics that might lead to conflict, we found ourselves having deep discussions about creativity, about the choices we make and why we make them, about the different ways to live a meaningful life. We could talk about money and security without it becoming an argument, because we all understood that these were legitimate concerns that needed to be balanced against other values. One evening, about a year after our reconciliation, I was having dinner at their house when my father made an observation that stopped me cold. "You know, Marcus, I think we were trying to protect you from the wrong things." "What do you mean?" "We were so focused on protecting you from financial instability, from the uncertainty of an artistic career, that we almost protected you from joy, from the satisfaction of doing work that matters to you, from the pride of creating something beautiful." My mother nodded. "We forgot that there are different kinds of security. There's financial security, which is important. But there's also the security of knowing who you are, of living in alignment with your values, of doing work that feeds your soul." "You have both now," my father continued. "You've figured out how to make a living doing what you love, but more than that, you've figured out how to live authentically. That's something we never managed at your age." It was such a simple statement, but it represented years of growth and understanding. They weren't just accepting my choices, they were genuinely proud of them, in ways that went beyond parental love to include professional respect and personal admiration. 2 years after our reconciliation, I received a phone call that would change everything again. My mother had been selected to participate in a group show at a prestigious gallery in Portland, not as a favor or a token gesture, but because her work had been reviewed and judged to be gallery-worthy by people who didn't know her personal story. The selection process had been blind. She had submitted slides of her paintings without any biographical information, and the jurors had chosen her work based purely on its artistic merit. When she called to tell me, she was crying so hard she could barely speak. "I can't believe it," she kept saying, After all these years, someone thinks my work is good enough. It's not just good enough, Mom, I told her. It's beautiful. It always has been. The opening reception for her group show was one of the proudest moments of my life. I watched her stand next to her paintings, 3 watercolors that explored themes of growth and transformation, talking knowledgeably with gallery visitors about her technique and inspiration. She was nervous but confident, professional but warm. Everything I had always known she could be if she gave herself the chance. My father was there too, of course, and his pride was evident in every word he spoke to anyone who would listen. "That's my wife," he would say, gesturing toward my mother. "She's an artist. Always has been, but it took her a while to remember." Several of her pieces sold that night, including one that was purchased by a collector who specialized in contemporary regional art. The prices weren't life-changing, but they were respectable. And more importantly, they represented validation from the art world that her work had value. But perhaps the most meaningful moment of the evening came when a young woman, probably around my age, approached my mother near the end of the reception. "Excuse me," she said, "but I just wanted to tell you how much your paintings mean to me. I'm an art teacher, and I see a lot of work by emerging artists. But there's something about your pieces. They have this wisdom, this depth that comes from life experience. It gives me hope that creativity doesn't have an expiration date." My mother looked at me over the young woman's shoulder, and I saw in her eyes the same joy and validation I had felt at my first gallery opening. She had found her way back to herself, and it was beautiful to witness. The success of my mother's show had an unexpected effect on my father's artistic journey as well. Seeing her receive recognition and validation seemed to give him permission to take his own work more seriously. He started entering his pottery into local craft fairs and juried shows, and while his success was more modest than my mother's, he began to develop a reputation as a skilled ceramicist with a distinctive style. More importantly, he began to think of himself as an artist again, not just someone who played with clay as a hobby, but someone who created functional art that brought beauty into people's daily lives. His pieces were practical, bowls and mugs and vases, but they were also beautiful, with subtle glazes and elegant forms that spoke to his developing aesthetic sensibility. 3 years after our reconciliation, we decided to have our first joint art show as a family. The local community center had a small gallery space, and they agreed to host an exhibition called 3 Generations, 3 Mediums: my digital design work, my mother's watercolors, and my father's ceramics. Planning the show together was an exercise in collaboration and compromise that brought us even closer. We had to think about how our different artistic styles would work together visually, how to present our work in ways that complemented rather than competed with each other, how to tell the story of our family's artistic journey in a way that would be meaningful to visitors. The opening reception was small but warm, attended by friends, neighbors, colleagues, and extended family members who had heard about our story. My cousin Jake was there, the same cousin my father had once held up as an example of practical success, and he spent a long time looking at our work with genuine interest and admiration. "I always wondered what it would be like to make something beautiful for a living," he told me. "I'm good with numbers, and I like the security of my job, but sometimes I wonder what I might have created if I had been braver." "It's not about being braver," I told him. "It's about finding what works for you. You create security and stability. That's a form of art too." But I also told him about the community college classes my parents had taken, about the pottery groups and painting circles that welcomed beginners, about the way creativity could be part of a life without having to be the center of it. During the reception, a local newspaper photographer took pictures of the three of us standing together in front of our work. When the article was published the following week, the headline read, "Family Finds Art in Life's Second Act." And the story focused on themes of creativity, sacrifice, and the different paths to artistic fulfillment. The article brought unexpected attention to our show, and we extended the run by 2 weeks to accommodate additional visitors. More importantly, it connected us with other families who had similar stories, parents who had given up artistic dreams, children who were pursuing creative careers, families who were trying to navigate the tension between practical concerns and creative aspirations. I started getting emails from people around the country who had read the article online. Some were young artists looking for advice about how to maintain relationships with parents who didn't understand their career choices. Others were older adults who were considering returning to creative pursuits they had abandoned decades earlier. Many were parents trying to figure out how to support their children's artistic dreams, while also helping them build stable lives. These conversations led to another project, a blog and eventually a book about families and creativity, exploring the different ways that artistic expression can be woven into family life across generations. I interviewed families where creativity was passed down like a treasured heirloom, families where it skipped generations and then re-emerged, families where it caused conflict, and families where it brought healing. The book, when it was finally published 2 years later, included an extended chapter about our family's journey. It explored the themes we had lived through: sacrifice and resentment, fear and courage, misunderstanding and eventually recognition. But it also included stories from dozens of other families who had navigated similar challenges. The publication of the book marked a new chapter in my career as well. I was still doing freelance design work, but I was also speaking at conferences and workshops, consulting with arts organizations about community engagement, and working on larger projects that combined my visual skills with my growing interest in storytelling and family dynamics. My parents became frequent collaborators in this work. My mother's paintings were often featured in my presentations about creativity and aging, and my father's story about returning to art after decades in a corporate job resonated with audiences of older adults who were considering their own creative pursuits. But perhaps more importantly, our professional collaborations grew out of a genuinely transformed personal relationship. We had moved beyond simply accepting each other's choices to actively supporting and celebrating them. We had learned to communicate openly about our fears and hopes, to acknowledge our mistakes without letting them define our future interactions, to see each other as complex individuals rather than just family members playing prescribed roles. 5 years after our reconciliation, my parents surprised me with an announcement that took my breath away. They had decided to take early retirement and use their savings to travel, spending extended periods in different places known for their artistic communities. They wanted to take classes with different teachers, learn new techniques, immerse themselves in creative environments they had only dreamed about when they were younger. "Life is short," my mother said, "and we've spent too many years playing it safe." "We're not being irresponsible," my father added quickly, falling back into old patterns of justifying non-practical choices. "We've done the math, we have enough saved, and we can always come back and find work if we need to." "Dad?" I interrupted him gently. "You don't have to justify this to me. I think it's amazing." And I did think it was amazing, but I was also deeply moved by what their decision represented. They had spent their 20s following their artistic dreams, their 30s and 40s sacrificing those dreams for family responsibilities. And now they were entering their 60s with the wisdom to know that there could be another chapter. One where they didn't have to choose between security and creativity, but could find ways to embrace both. Their first destination was a small artist colony in New Mexico, where they spent 3 months in a residency program designed specifically for older adults returning to art. They sent me photos of their work, my mother's watercolors taking on new boldness and experimentation as she worked in the desert light, my father's ceramics becoming more sculptural and expressive as he learned new techniques from master potters. But more than the photos of their artwork, I treasured the pictures they sent of themselves. They looked younger, happier, more alive than I had seen them in years. They were holding hands in front of art installations, covered in clay dust and paint, laughing with other artists, fully immersed in the creative life they had once thought was lost to them forever. When they returned home after that first residency, they were different people. Not just happier, but more confident, more willing to take risks, more open to new experiences. They had proven to themselves that they could still learn, still grow, still create work that mattered. The transformation affected every aspect of their lives. They redesigned their house to better accommodate their art practice, converting not just the garage, but also a spare bedroom into studio space. They joined local arts organizations and began showing their work regularly. They even started teaching classes, sharing their skills with other older adults who were interested in exploring creativity. But perhaps most significantly, they started talking about the future with excitement rather than anxiety. Instead of focusing on all the things that could go wrong as they aged, they were making plans for all the places they wanted to visit, the techniques they wanted to learn, the projects they wanted to complete. 6 years after our reconciliation, I received a call that brought our story full circle in the most unexpected way. A young artist had seen the community center exhibition from several years earlier and had been following our family's journey through social media and my writing. She was struggling with her own family relationships, parents who wanted her to give up her artistic dreams and pursue something more practical. And she wondered if I would be willing to talk with them. "They might listen to you," she said. "You're their age, you have a stable life, and you understand what it's like to be an artist. Maybe you could help them see that it's possible to support your child's dreams without giving up your concerns about their future." The conversation that followed was surreal in its familiarity. I found myself sitting across from parents whose fears and concerns were almost identical to what my own parents had expressed years earlier. But this time, I was able to speak from both sides of the experience, as someone who had pursued an artistic career despite family opposition, and as someone who had come to understand the genuine love and concern that motivated that opposition. More importantly, I was able to share my parents' story with them, not just the happy ending, but the difficult middle chapters, the years of misunderstanding and pain that had preceded our eventual reconciliation. I could talk about the real challenges of an artistic career while also talking about its rewards, about the ways that family support could make those challenges more manageable rather than eliminating them entirely. The conversation didn't solve everything immediately, but it opened up a dialogue that had been closed before. The young artist contacted me several months later to tell me that her relationship with her parents was slowly improving, that they were beginning to ask questions about her work instead of just expressing criticism, that they had even attended one of her shows. This experience led to more opportunities to work with families navigating similar conflicts. I started offering workshops called Creative Families, Bridging the Generation Gap, where parents and adult children could come together to talk openly about their different perspectives on creativity, career choices, and family expectations. The workshops were always emotional. There were tears and arguments and moments of breakthrough understanding. Parents talked about their fears of seeing their children struggle, their own dreams deferred, their desire to protect the people they loved from disappointment. Adult children talked about feeling unsupported, about the isolation of pursuing unconventional paths, about the pressure to choose between family approval and personal authenticity. But there were also moments of recognition, when parents saw their own abandoned dreams reflected in their children's current pursuits. When children realized that criticism might be misexpressed love, when families found new ways to support each other that honored both practical concerns and creative aspirations. My parents often attended these workshops as guest speakers, sharing their story with other families who were struggling with similar dynamics. Watching them talk about their journey, the mistakes they had made, the lessons they had learned, the joy they had found in returning to art, was always powerful. But it was especially meaningful to see how their vulnerability and honesty helped other families begin their own conversations. 7 years after our reconciliation, my mother had her first solo show at the same gallery that had displayed my poster design years earlier. The same poster that had started their journey back to understanding and supporting my choices. The show was called Late Bloomers, and it featured watercolors that explored themes of growth, transformation, and second chances. The opening reception was packed with people whose lives our family's story had touched over the years. There were other older adults who had returned to art after decades away, young artists whose family relationships had improved, families who had attended our workshops, and art lovers who had simply been moved by my mother's work. But the moment that meant the most to me came when a teenage girl approached my mother near the end of the evening. She was there with her grandmother, who had been attending my mother's painting classes at the community center. "My grandma talks about you all the time," the girl said. "She says you're proof that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." My mother looked at me over the girl's head, tears in her eyes, and I knew she was thinking the same thing I was, that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that bring us back to ourselves. The story of our family's reconciliation and artistic revival has continued to evolve and deepen over the years that followed. But perhaps the most important lesson we learned is that family relationships, like artistic skills, require ongoing practice and attention. Understanding doesn't happen once and then remain fixed forever. It's something we have to choose again and again, especially when faced with new challenges or changes. My parents are now in their early 60s, still traveling and creating, still surprising themselves, and everyone around them with their willingness to try new things and take creative risks. My father recently had a piece accepted into a national ceramics exhibition, and my mother is planning her second solo show. They've become fixtures in the local arts community, known not just for their own work, but for their mentorship of other older adults who are exploring creativity. As for me, I'm still working as a graphic designer, but my career has expanded to include writing, speaking, and consulting work around creativity and family dynamics. The poster design that started this whole journey, the one my parents saw in the coffee shop window, has been reprinted and displayed in galleries as part of exhibitions about community art and social engagement. But more than any professional success, what I treasure most is the relationship we've built together. We've learned to see each other as whole people, rather than just family members playing expected roles. We've learned to communicate about difficult topics without falling into old patterns of hurt and misunderstanding. We've learned that love can be expressed through support and encouragement, rather than just worry and protection. Family dynamics are complex, and healing doesn't happen overnight. But when we're willing to listen to each other's stories, to look beyond our assumptions and hurt feelings, to approach each other with curiosity rather than judgment, we sometimes discover that the love we thought was missing was there all along. It was just speaking a language we hadn't learned to understand yet. Our story continues to unfold, with new chapters and challenges and celebrations. But the foundation we've built together, based on honest communication, mutual respect, and shared creative passion, feels strong enough to weather whatever comes next. And sometimes, late at night when I'm working in my studio, I think about that young couple in the photograph my mother sent me all those years ago. They gave up their artistic dreams so their son could pursue his. But in the end, supporting his dreams led them back to their own, and all three of us found our way to exactly where we were meant to be.